Hi, everybody, and a very good morning to you all. Looks like most people are with us now, so we'll make a start. So thank you very much for joining us this morning for what is the final K3 Hub CPD webinar before we have a short summer break. I'll tell you more about what we've got coming up after the summer, just before I hand over to our speaker. But if this is your first time at a K3 Hub webinar, then my name is Marie Wadeson. I'm a managing director at Quantuma, and on behalf of our parent company, the K3 Capital Group, I lead the K3 Hub, which is a member network for professional advisors developed by us and other companies within the group. By way of a bit more background, K3 Hub launched in the spring of 2021, and we're proud to have over 3,500 members. K3 Hub offers a range of CPD and training sessions, not dissimilar to today's event, and there's a bit more of a summary on the screen now. A few pieces of housekeeping just before I introduce you to our speaker today. So you will have noticed as you join the webinar that we are recording. Recordings will be posted onto the K3 Hub and Quantuma website, so that should be done very early next week. Q&A function is open, so do feel free to get involved and ask questions as we go. Preference is if you could just channel your questions through the Q&A function rather than the chat. It just helps us keep everything in one place for our speaker. We're going to post a full PDF of the slides into the chat shortly. I think I've just seen that being done, actually. And then we'll do that periodically throughout the session for anybody who joins slightly later. We recognise today is quite a long session, so we are going to take a couple of comfort breaks of about 5-10 minutes each, and Jeremy will signify when they are. And one of the final points is that we are running some polls today. They are anonymous and are just for fun, so do get involved. Right, so on to today's webinar then. So very pleased to welcome back a very regular speaker for us here at the K3 Hub, Jeremy Mindell, who I'm sure many of you already know from past events. Jeremy's been lecturing in taxation for over 20 years. He covers issues relating to pensions, share schemes, and remuneration. And he's a qualified chartered tax advisor and also holds a certificate from the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. Today, Jeremy will be covering the difference between machine learning and generative AI, the importance of databases, what AI can and cannot do, overhauling processes and procedures, and ethical and safeguarding issues. Just before I hand over to Jeremy, a few words about some of the sessions that we've got coming up in the autumn. We're back on the 19th of September with a rundown of everything that's happening in the world of restructuring. We've got another CPD session on the 26th of September. Subject matter between September and December include commercial property taxes, accounting issues, employment law myths, and year-end tax planning. Invitations are always sent out on a regular basis, so do keep an eye on your inbox for those. We also promote the events on the K3 Hub website and the Quantuma website, and also on LinkedIn. I hope that you enjoyed today's session. Wishing you a great weekend and a great summer. And Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie. So good morning, everybody. This session on taxation and artificial intelligence. Well, given the number of people here, it is obviously a subject of the moment, and we are being bombarded with information, as always, about different subjects. But as you'll see in the theme running through this presentation, it's how you use the information that is so important, that I would say distinguishes the machine from the person. I want to, before I start, just give a very quick shout out to a couple of people who've helped me with the presentation. So there was Dan Dronsfield of T-Tech, accountancy technologist, who kindly allowed me to use a few of his slides. And then various members of the family, including my son, Alex, who actually works for the Department for Transport, looking at their AI strategy. So what I really wanted then to go on is to talk about what are the predictions that you might have in terms of AI, and how is that going to work? So I think a lot of us may remember, of a certain age, 2001, A Space Odyssey, with HAL, H-A-L, in it, who eventually takes over and kills most of the people on the spacecraft. And indeed, if you look at some of the ethical and other concerns, there are people who think that AI could do the same thing today, or if not today, in the future. And I know people who look at the sort of boundaries that we should have for AI. I'm not as worried about it as that, but something I saw on the tube last night was a good one. Stop hiring humans. The era of AI employees is here. A company called artisan.co. I haven't been on their website to see what they're looking at or and so on, but an interesting idea of the future. I would say that I don't think that either of those, either 2001: A Space Odyssey, nor stopping hiring humans, is likely to be the case. But of course, there is that possibility. But I think it's unlikely, I would have thought. So I've already been asked, how does one start learning AI from the perspective, I would have said, of an old accountant? And I think that the point would be that it's done, in my view, cautiously. And I think it's a bit like, it's quite an interesting question. It's a bit like, using Google Maps or something without present preparations, without some idea of where you're going. It is quite easy to get the wrong place on some unadopted road in the middle of nowhere. I've done it myself. And if you haven't got some idea where you're going, then quite often on navigation, you end up in the wrong place. The same is true with AI. I think you start off with things you know and see whether AI helps you and how much it helps you, I think is incredibly important on that basis. What you don't want to do is say, as we'll see, is an unguided element. AI will help you in certain ways, but you've got to know what you're doing in order for it to help. Some idea of where you're going, just as you might well do with Google Maps. For example, I live in Holly Park, and there are two Holly Parks not too far away from each other, and you do need to know which Holly Park you're going to in order to get to the right place. The pace of change on AI. So somebody asked, sort of how would an old accountant get used to it? But actually, AI has been around quite a long time. So, you're talking about the Dartmouth Conference back in 1956. So we're talking only about if you think that computers were generally, developed during the Second World War, Alan Turing, Bletchley Park, and all of that. This is not that long afterwards. We're talking about the Dartmouth Conference first used the AI term. Then you've got 1977, the PhD looked at the vision, the brain, and the AI, and his paper helped define deep learning. You've got Google Transform in 2017, AlphaFold DeepMind in 2020, GPT 3.5 in 2022, GPT-4 in 2023, GPT OI in 01 or OI in 2024, and then agents in 2025, models capable of extended planning and execution across days. There are some gaps there, and my son helped me fill in some of the gaps. 1997, IBM Deep Blue, which was rules based. And that was the foundation of the sort of Kasparov versus the computer in terms of chess. IBM Watson 2011, the start of deep learning and neural networks, and 2017 transformers leading to generative AI. And what we can see is that the time taken to reach 100 million users is now measured not in years, but in months. So there is an element there of a momentum and a speeding up. and very much of the sort of the curve that goes like that. So we've got a situation where there's a lot of momentum, a lot of discussion about it, and a lot of speculation about how far it will go. But if you look at the chat GBT, launched and within a matter of a few months, reaching 100 million users. So there is a lot of excitement, there is a lot of development. And as I say, this seems to be reaching the sort of exponential curve on this. The point I'd make is, have we been here before? And this is where, if you like, the old accountant and the old tax advisor, or at least middle-aged tax advisor, would recognize other changes that were promised, which would revolutionize our world. You know, the photocopier. Yeah? Actually, they did a study of the Foreign Office and worked out, this is many years ago, historic study, that actually the photocopier made the Foreign Office less efficient rather than more efficient, but was seen as a revolutionary change. Databases, of course, the databases again are not new, but were supposed to again reduce the regular work, the sort of grunt work, for want of a better term, that one needed to do. Precedent files. I recall the occasion when people said, oh, you know, you wouldn't need that many lawyers because everything would be downloaded from precedents. The word processor. I am old enough to remember the time before word processors, where everything was done on typing machines, and word processors were just sort of vaguely starting, moving to Word and Excel. And on that basis, what are we looking at with precedents? Well, the precedent is that new technology promises a lot, doesn't always deliver as much as people think, and doesn't seem to reduce the workload. I would say most people are as busy as they've ever been. And, you know, the time when we're just going to have leisure and machines doing everything for us seems to be disappearing into the horizon. Certainly, technology changes have not really changed a great deal on that basis so far. In terms of reducing people's overall workloads, it may change what people do, but it doesn't seem to change the burden of your workload. Unless somebody wants to disagree with me. We have a poll about what you actually do, Helen. Could we put the poll up about, let's see what sort of audience I've got here. I think that should be fine. People should know what they've done. What's the answers on those? Oh, lots of accountants, a few tax advisors, and a few lawyers, and just one person who's put other. Okay, well, so generally speaking, more accountants. If I look at the different types of AI, we've got machine learning, deep learning, and what is getting people very excited, which is generative AI. And that's the area that people are talking about the most. Machine learning takes existing data. The model learns from that data. The more data, the more reliable the output on that basis. And it's an interesting point. You know, it's like with most stuff, whether it's, you know, HMRC tools or any tool that you do, rubbish in is rubbish out. And I always think about that in terms of AI, is that you need to know where the AI is taking the source in order to know whether it's likely to be reliable or not. So again, we'll talk about biases later on, but what distinguishes the different AI offerings, some of them paid for, some of them not, is indeed elements which talk about what data are you mining it from. So obviously this is a Tolley's talk, and for example, the LexisNexis Tolley's AI sources come from the wealth of data that Tolley's have built up over the years. And that gives a greater emphasis, obviously, on the relevant tax pieces that one could look at. Generative AI can accept and answer questions in human language, can change the style of the language, and can draw pictures or create poems and essays. Indeed, during this presentation, you'll see design, which is a tool connected to PowerPoint, which I've used for some pictures. Sometimes it works well. Sometimes you think, no, I think I need something different. But for example, I use AI to, say, dictate notes into my telephone, then probably clunkily transfer it into Word and get Copilot or someone to sort of get rid of the typos in someone. I mean, they ask me, do I want to change my style of language? And I say, no, it's Jeremy language, but I would like the typos to disappear and, you know, all the errors to disappear. And it does a pretty good job about that, I have to say. That's different from getting AI to form a response. You know, this is my talk, my language. And, you know, AI knows its limitations. I just want it to, you know, deal with my grammar, deal with the mistakes in transcription. And of course, I'm still going to have to go through it once or twice, but it does reduce the time in terms of writing articles and other elements that I want to do. And that, I think, is quite important on that basis. So I've got an article, example, today, I think, coming out in Tax Journal. I dictated the article into the telephone, and then just got AI to correct my language or my grammar, and then went through it again and did a few more changes. But it did compact the process whilst not impinging on the fact that it is my work, what I've done. So that's one way. In terms of other elements, you look at different AI compared traditional predictive AI. So good example would be, I don't know, predictive texts. How often have the predictive text gone wrong? Well, quite often. And that does show certain of the limitations in terms of you do a text on WhatsApp or whatever, or emails, and sometimes they'll be able to predict what you want to say, and quite often they don't. And then, of course, there's generative AI, which is more creative and flexible. And this is a good example of AI doing quite a good thing. You know, predictive and reliable comes from, you know, the text of data on the left. Creative and flexible, just put that in, and it comes up with an artist brushing a canvas in something that looks a bit like a Jackson Pollock type of piece of art. What I would say is technology is not a magic wand to solve all our problems. It may help, it may hinder, it may lead you down the right track, but it's not a magic wand on that basis. So it is only in November 2022, so 2.5 years ago, that Chat GPT was launched. And so this is relatively recent. And where I wonder, taking sort of the long view, is emails were introduced over 30 years ago. And yet we still struggle with the protocols over emails. So the human brain hasn't got much faster, in my view, if at all. But, how do we respond to emails? Are we governed by them? Do we respond immediately? Do we take our time? Do we think about it overnight? What is the expectation of the person sending the email? All of those elements are elements that you need to think about. Because if we've struggled with the protocols over emails in 30 years, GPT is only 2.5 years old. So wouldn't surprise me if we struggle over those protocols too. And the issues are tax and others. And going back to emails, I started getting a lot more emails saying brilliant. And I thought to myself, well, I must be doing a really good job. And actually, I then realized when sort of suggested replies came up, that brilliant was often one of the suggested replies. And various people would just use that to acknowledge I'd sent them something fairly routine. And you do therefore know, and people can spot fairly quickly when the response is AI generated rather than somebody thinking about it. And so the question comes up, what might AI achieve? Well, it may give you quicker research, may give you a template for some correspondence. You may end up being able to use it for a database and assisting in compliance and risk analysis. What might AI achieve? Well, for the tax authorities, the collection of data, connecting data to appropriate individual or corporate records, identifying issues or taxpayers to investigate, automating replies. That doesn't work always that well. I got a letter from HMRC that was completely didn't answer the question or deal with the issue, and you could tell it'd been AI generated. But also potentially the quicker processing of returns correspondence and other information. So why don't we go, Helen, for poll 2 at this point? Okay. Oh, 2/3, 1/3. Interesting. Interesting. Interesting that 1/3 of you think it's a threat to your jobs. One of the reasons why I don't think it will change things as much as people think is because work expands to fill the time available. Now, even when I was doing US federal and state and city and school board returns back in the 1980s, would you believe? When I was only a baby, of course. You felt to yourself, actually, this would be impossible to do without a computerized system. And the computerized system was quite slow then. You had something called fast tax. You filled in manually the figures and check boxes. You then sent it off in an envelope to fast tax, maybe by courier. Fast tax would prepare it and send you back the return. And I remember working in Brussels for some time where I worked, this was at Cooper's and Lybrand, and what they reviewed was the input, not the return immediately, because it took time to get the paper to Fastax. Fastax processed it and came back. And what you wanted to do was try and avoid reruns in terms of returns. Very different system from now. But there was no doubt. I believe there was one person who was paranoid about computers, where we used to do the return for, I don't know, it was like double or treble the normal price because we did it all manually and typed it all on forms. But generally speaking, the returns could not be done without computers. Now, at some point between 1913 or 14, when US income tax was introduced, and sort of the 1980s, people were doing manual returns, so it was possible to do. Now it's arguable, given the size of US returns, that it'd almost be impossible to do without computers. There's still quite a lot of work involved, and I would argue that the work expands to fill the time available. A certain amount of that has also happened in the UK with complexity creep, as I would call it, where tax authorities know that most people use computers and therefore are quite happy to do things that are more complex, saying, well, you can always use a computer for that. But obviously, as I say, the work expands to fill either the time or the technology available. And that's been a feature in all sorts of areas. A friend was talking to me last night about the fact that he worked in an organization where an accountant had kept all the accounts of this company from the 1960s to now. Don't know why he'd kept the old accounts, but, matter of history, from about 1964. Do you know how many pages the accounts were in 1964? Anyone want to guess? And how many pages were you talking about in 2025? How many pages for the same company that you'd be looking at? Anybody prepared to take a guess on that? How many pages do you think for a company might be the accounts in 1964, and how many do you think they'd be today? Anyone? No one prepared to take a guess even. Oh, somebody has. No, Caroline, thank you for giving me a thought on that. The factors are there. 6 times more if a large company, but I actually think it was larger in the 1960s, and now you're looking at about 30 pages in 1964, 65. You're looking at 225 pages now. And whether actually that is a service to investors is another matter. But that sort of increase, that would be what I would be looking at on that basis. You're looking at, sort of 30, as I say, plays 225 now for the same company on that basis, which is quite incredible on that basis, the increase. And of course, part of it is because you can. Part of it is because people say, well, I can add this compliance requirement because new technology will take care of it. Of course, it doesn't take care of it all. And it leaves the investor with a huge amount of information, which they're not, most of them won't be expected to be able to read. And the same is true about computations, if you look at capital allowances, under the new full expensing regime, where effectively every asset needs to be looked at separately, because if it's sold under full expensing, you get a full clawback of the amount receipts you get as a sort of balancing charge. So every asset needs to be denoted separately. That's an enormous amount of work. And I suspect HMRC would not have put it on had it not been for the fact that you've got computers, which should make it easier. And this is happening all the time. The average contract in the age of typewriters was around about 15 pages. The average contract now is about 100 pages. So technology does have this habit of creating more work and has done so ever since the days of the spinning jenny and the looms and the Luddites and so on back in the 1800s. So let's have a look at some of the other elements and some of the problems with AI, apart from creating more work for people. One of the issues is what we call hallucination, getting completely the wrong end of the stick, as this recent letter from HMRC did. And unguided AI is a bit like an unguided missile and is therefore likely to cause you considerable issues. AI hallucinations are incorrect or misleading results that AI models generate. These errors can be caused by a variety of factors, including insufficient training data, the model's statistical nature, incorrect assumptions made by the model, biases in the data used to train the model, and that is very prevalent in newer generative models. And so therefore, again, it needs a human being to spot, if I take this route, I'm going to end up miles and miles away from my proper destination that I want to go to. And there's either because I've inputted the wrong information or the model has not taken account of roadworks and traffic and so on. The other element with tax, as much as anything else, is tax changes constantly. And with tax changes, you've got to work out, is AI drawing them out of from out of date sources? So I did an article not that long ago, and I thought, I wonder if AI would produce anything different. And AI did. It told me that the additional rate of tax started at a threshold of £150,000. That is more than 2 years out of date. And therefore, on that basis, everyone knows it's £125,140. And you do think to yourself, where are they taking this information from? It could be out of date, and it could also be quite US biased as well. All those Zs instead of Ss, all the US perspective on taxation, all the US terms which are different from UK terms, all of that is understandable because the US is leading the charge on AI. But you need to understand from a UK element, we'll have a UK bias. I'm assuming I haven't got very many Americans on this call because they're all celebrating their Independence Day. I would comment that given that the American Revolution was based on taxation, and I look at the IRS code, when I've looked at it, I'm not sure that they've done very well in terms of reducing their burdens of taxation. But there you go. You make your choices, you live with them, as do future generations. This is a case of this going wrong, and there was a recent, even more recent case on this basis. F. Harbour versus HMRC 2023. The taxpayer cited 9 cases to support her appeal against a penalty. All were fictitious, was directed by the judge to provide full judgments. They were longer, but still fictitious. And that shows where it can all go horribly wrong. There was a US case, Matter Abianca US case. There again, barristers relied on fictitious cases generated by GPT. Indeed, there was an even more recent case where the courts were a bit more sympathetic, but again, sorry, AI had not done the client any service. And then you get to hear all sorts of horror stories like people being asked, I downloaded this opinion from AI. Do you think it's right? And you think, you know, all sorts of issues with that on that basis. But the point would be is that companies and practices need to think about their use of AI and how much employees can use it, and what safeguards they need to take against abuse of AI, and indeed in their relationship with clients as well. Generative AI does not understand material. It is trained to give plausible answers. But in the words of the late, great Eric Morecambe, not necessarily in the right order. And in these cases, not necessarily the right ones. Some of you will remember Eric Morecambe famously saying, when he's supposed to play Grieg's piano concerto, I'm playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. My point would be, is that again, when you look at generative AI, you do need to have the spirit of skepticism that Eric Morecambe had, albeit about piano playing rather than computers. After these sorts of issues came up about sort of defendants or advocates in a case arguing AI, you ended up with more updated advice, and that updated advice is very interesting. Adobe Preview, I'm assuming you're saying, again, it doesn't always come up with what is appropriate on that basis, and I would agree. A lot of these preview things don't really work terribly well. And of course, because everybody else is getting the same sort of prompts instead of replies, you can probably tell when it has been AI generated or not. So I will look at the judge's AI advice, because I think it's quite useful piece that may come up in tribunals and so on, tax tribunals and so on. So recent advice on that basis. It expands the glossary of common terms, provides additional details on misinformation, bias, quality of data sets, and other areas of concern. It also advises judges that they are responsible for AI-generated information they present to the court tribunal, just as for any other type of evidence. And you can't say, sort of, it's a bit like the dog ate my work. You can't say, well, this may be a load of nonsense that I've sworn on oath, but it was AI generated. That does not work. It also highlights the availability of Microsoft's private AI tool, Copilot Chat, for judicial office holders through their e-judiciary accounts. This guidance applies to all judicial office holders for whom the Lady Chief Justice and the senior president of the tribunal are responsible, including their clerks, judicial assistants, legal advisors, officers, and other support staff. It goes through the guidance a number of useful terms. So algorithm, which is a set of instructions used to perform tasks such as calculations and data analysis, usually using a computer or another smart device. Alignment, any process by which artificial intelligence systems are aligned with organizational goals or ethical principles, such as in relation to de-biasing. Remember, if, for example, all my sources were The Guardian and the New Statesman, a bit like, yeah, then I'm going to have one bias, which may be different from if I'm reading Guido Fawkes in The Spectator. So, yeah, you got to look at where are they trawling for information. Yeah, in the same basis that when you have a historical document, you need to understand that just because it's a few hundred years old or a few thousand years, it is not authoritative in the same way that you wouldn't normally just take one newspaper and say, well, that's an authoritative guide to everyone's perspective in terms of the historical event. Alignment, any process by which artificial intelligence systems are aligned with organizational goals or ethical principles on that basis. And I say, such as in relation to de-biasing, it's important that you understand that the advice you give should be as free of bias. And if there are biases, they should be recognizable biases on that basis. Artificial intelligence, computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. AI agents, so they are a software program that uses AI to become aware of its environment, process information, and take actions to achieve its goals based on the inputted information. And then you get an AI prompt, and that would be an input or instruction given to an AI system, which will generate a specific response or result. Typically, the prompt is in the form of text, but many chatbots, not boxes, will now accept voice prompts as well, although it needs to normally get used to your voice. Let's look at prompting. So prompting looks at providing context, guidance in framing questions, guidance on the type of response required, its intended use and format, which, if used properly, is very useful. If not used properly, will lead you up the garden path. What prompt libraries do will be to standardize responses and give more consistency in terms of answers that you might get. And then you look at things such as calibrating questions, looking at how polite you should be, or you should always be polite, and the complexity of the said question that you are asking. In terms of the temperature as a concept, a low temperature one is a question or a prompt that is more straightforward, reduces the risk of hallucination. A high one maximizes creative power, but also increases the possibility of hallucination. And then we get to our friend predictive text. How often have you had something where somebody says, don't look at my last WhatsApp or email or text because it's full of rubbish, because it's got a predictive, I didn't check the predictive text on it. So LLMs are AI models which learn to predict the next best word or part of a word in a sentence, having been trained on enormous quantities of text. ChatGPT and Big Chat use the open AI large language model, the large language model. But I'm sure you found that every so often they go horribly wrong. And that may be a good guidance point, to the point that they can be useful from time to time. But often you do need to judge, because otherwise you can end up with all sorts of problems. And then you get something called natural language processing. That is programming computer systems to understand and generate human speech and text. And algorithms look for linguistic patterns in how sentences and paragraphs are constructed and how words, context, and structure work together to create meaning. Applications include speech to text converters, which I do enjoy using from time to time, but need quite a lot of work. Online tools that summarize text, chatbots, speech recognition, and translations. So, as I understand it, the translation functions have certainly evolved and are now, quite good, relatively reliable, should be used by somebody who knows something about the other language. And so you come on to the element of what is known as responsible AI, which is the practice of designing, developing, and deploying AI with certain values, such as being trustworthy, ethical, transparent, explainable, fair, robust, and upholding privacy rights. Well, let's think about that for a minute. You should be doing that all the time. I can't think that you'd want to be doing the opposite. A truism is where the opposite is inconceivable. In the professional world, you want to be seen as trustworthy, you want to be seen as ethical, transparent as far as possible. You want your explanations to work. You need to be fair, robust, and upholding privacy rights. And I can't think that you'd want to be untrustworthy, unethical, opaque, impossible to explain, inexplicable, unfair, weak, and careless with your data. I mean, so it's fairly obvious. It's a bit like motherhood and apple pie. You want to do those things, but whether AI helps or hinders is another matter. In terms of a technology-assisted review, AI tools used as part of the disclosure process to identify potentially relevant documents. And of course, what do you think might happen in terms of the documents that are produced? What does anyone think in the chat box that what might happen? Anyone? What do you think might happen with a technology-assisted review? Well, we'll put it this way. Do you think you end up with more documents or less? No? No one's prepared to answer. Oh, someone's put something in the Q&A. I think, thank you for the answer, Joe. I'm not sure, having my researches in AI, you tend to get more documents unless you nail down very clearly what you're trying to get an answer to. You end up with a wealth of documents, as we'll see. In TAR, machine learning, which means more reviewing. A machine learning system is trained on data created by lawyers who identify relevant documents manually. Then the tool uses the learned criteria to identify other similar documents from very large disclosure data sets. But as we'll see, quite often it will produce more, not less, information for you to plow through, therefore increasing your workload. Then let's look at our limitations that we may have on that basis. So the limitations are public AI chat boxes do not provide answers from authoritative databases. They generate new text using an algorithm based on the prompts they receive and the data they have been trained upon. This means the output from which AI chatbots generate is what the model predicts to be the most likely combination of words based on the documents, the data that it holds as source information. It is not necessarily the most accurate answer. So where you use a defined database for law, or a purpose-built one for law or tax, you're more likely to get an answer which hits the spot rather than a splurging of words. The other element you need to watch about for public AI chatbots is where it's general, not specific. As with any other information available on the internet in general, AI tools may be useful to find material you would recognize as correct, but have not got to hand. But, and this is the legal advice from the Lady Justice produced by the Ministry of Justice, Department of Justice, but they are a poor way of conducting research to find new information you cannot verify. So if I find a case which helps me, which I've never heard about, it's useful to find out from a trusted tax database or a trusted source that actually the case exists. They may be seen as the best way of obtaining non-definitive confirmation of something rather than providing immediately correct facts. You need to know the rough route map to use AI effectively. And therefore, the quality of any answers you receive will depend on how you engage with the relevant AI tool, including the nature of the prompts you enter and the quality of the underlying data sets. These may include misinformation, whether deliberate or otherwise, selected data or data that is not up to date. Even with the best prompts in the world, the information provided may be inaccurate, incomplete, misleading, or biased. The currently available LLMs appear to have been trained, large language models, on material published on the internet. Their view of the law is often heavily based on US law, although some do purport to be able to distinguish between that and English law. Given how often they misspell things, I think that is questionable indeed. And then looking at protecting privacy, this is important, and your firms, whoever you work for, need to think about this. Do not enter any information into a public AI chatbot that's not already in the public domain. Do not enter information which is private or confidential. Any information that you input into a public AI chatbot should be seen as being published to all the world. That's a good way of looking at it. The current publicly available AI chatbots remember every question that you ask them, as well as any other information you put into them. There's no sort of compact of forgetting or, a requirement to forget within a particular period of time. That information is then available to be used to respond to queries from other users. As a result, anything you type in could become publicly known. You should disable the chat history in public AI chatbots if this option is available, as it should prevent your data from being used to train the chatbot, and after 30 days, the conversations will be permanently deleted. This option is currently available in ChatGPT and Google Gemini, but not in other chatbots. Even with history turned off, though, it should be assumed that data entered is being disclosed. And then in terms of apps and smartphones, some AI platforms, particularly if used as an app on a smartphone, may request various permissions which give them access to information on your device. If it is a work phone, you should refuse all such permissions. And then data breaches. If the disclosed information includes personal data, the disclosure should be reported as data incident. And that's the case even in terms of your data protection policies. Potentially, you need to think about updating those. And then in terms of the legal side, this is for judges and their people, but again, similar for private practice. Details of how to report a data incident to the judicial office can be found on the judicial intranet. You should treat all public AI tools as being capable of making public anything entered into them. And then the other element is fiction. AI tools may make up, as we've seen in the Ed Harbor case, fictitious cases, citations or quotes, or refer to legislation, articles, or legal texts that do not exist, provide incorrect or misleading information regarding the law, how it might apply, and make factual errors. And therefore, as a final thought, before you have your tea or coffee, bias. Be aware of your own as well as others. And at that point, let's take a 10-minute tea break. Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions. So I assume that more documents are needed in order for AI to accurately cross-reference the information. Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it's, you take one source and there would be an issue with that, and we'll discuss that more. How do you know if you're using a public AI chatbot? Well, it's generally one that is free to use and is just available for anybody to access. Would be a good hint that it is a public chatbot. Any other questions? Okay. Right. Okay, so in terms of biases, as I say, are you using the information? And people do a lot of, the term confirmation bias is an old established term. It's something that you would expect to find used a great deal. And is more so because, if you like, the public realm has become less easy. So if you think about it, in the past, people had one or two sources of information in terms of, I know, the BBC and ITV, and that's where they'd get their news, and they would sort of there would be a public space that most people would act on. Now, of course, with the multitude of websites and other elements, that is going to be a challenge for them, because you can choose your website to, to reinforce your opinion about something, and you do need to be aware of your own biases and, of course, others. What is the standpoint from which they are writing the article, or they are, a pressure group or a campaigning group, and will use figures on that basis. It's quite interesting. You see a lot of information about the effect of domicile changes on how many people have left the country, and the data can be used in different ways by different organizations on the basis the same data can be used to prove two different things. It's a bit like, if I have a lot of alcohol in the house, is that because I drink a lot, or is it because I don't drink a lot, and therefore when people give me alcohol, it sort of sits around for ages? Well, either explanation is a tenable one, but may depend on how you view my drinking habits. Generally speaking, I don't drink a great deal, so the alcohol tends to stick around quite a long time in between parties, entertainment, and social occasions. Just so you know. But that's a good example of where you can take a piece of information. He's got lots of alcohol in the cupboards, and does that mean, what does that mean about him? Well, actually, it means, in this case, you could take either tenable interpretation, but I would say it's because I don't drink a great deal. In terms of useful tasks, tools are for summarizing large bodies of text. As with any summary, care needs to be taken to ensure the summary is accurate. AI tools can be used in writing presentations to provide suggestions for topics to cover. Now, my experience with that so far has not been that it's been that brilliant. Very useful in terms of design and pictures and so on, although I do tend to feel that they make the text too small. And administrative tasks can be performed by AI, including composing, summarizing, prioritizing emails, transcribing and summarizing meetings, and composing memoranda on that basis. What is dangerous is maybe on legal research, and we'll come to tax research. AI tools are a poor way of conducting research to find information you cannot verify independently. They may be useful as a way to be reminded of material you would recognize as correct. And the legal analysis is that the current public AI chatbots do not produce convincing analysis or reasoning on that basis. Generally speaking, you probably want to pay a subscription for a situation or an environment where the information is curated. How do you get indications the work may have been produced by AI? So, references to cases that do not sound familiar or have unfamiliar citations, particularly from the US. Parties citing different bodies of case law in relation to the same legal issues. Submissions that do not accord with your general understanding of the law in the area. That's, the map, making sure you've got the map, which helps you. There's no substitute for having an idea of where you're going. I love this one. Submissions that use American spelling or refer to overseas cases, all those Zs and so on. Content that superficially appears to be highly persuasive and well written, but on closer inspection contains obvious substantive errors. But you need the experience to look at that. Other elements that you need to think about would be, does the language sound natural or stilted? Not your known style. So most of us have developed a style over a period of time. Does it really sound like the Jeremy style or not? And of course, what you need to be very careful is boilerplate language. So let's look a little bit more in detail about tax and AI. So look at R&D. Look at that a little bit in more detail later on. HMRC requires an additional information form, which is, of course, machine readable. How do you think that AIF was, or other claims, have been abused by people making dubious claims? Anyone? How could I take an HMRC form and potentially end up with something that is completely wrong? Anyone? This happens allegedly in the green jellyfish claims on that. Anyone? Well, what are the issues with HMRC machine readable technology, or any technology? That's all. What are they designed to do? Well, it sort of looks for words and phrases on that basis. So if it's looking for words and phrases, the element that you would think about there is that so you know what words and phrases they are looking for, what sort of hits the right spot, a bit like going dating or something. And so green jellyfish allegedly used significant words and phrases in their research and development forms that HMRC would think, that is the sort of case that we would accept. So again, hitting the right buttons. And so people took it a step further and said, well, this is what they're expecting us to see in the documentation. And therefore, we'll make sure those words are in the documentation. It didn't mean that the claim was any more valid, and indeed gave them significant challenges in the future on that basis when those claims were challenged. I'll talk more about that later on. But that's a good example of the use and abuse of AI in the tax world. The OECD statistics were that 58 tax authorities were already using AI. It was either developed or in the process of being developed. Used by tax authorities, the IRS has 9 voice bots, 10 chat bots, and 24,000 payment plans established on that basis. In terms of Alex, the Aussie virtual assistant, developing and improving answers on that basis. So again, something that is being done. And of course, chatbots don't always get it right. And virtual assistants, again, don't always get it right on that basis. The ATO, the Australian Tax Office, use of AI. So in elements such as the Panama Papers, superannuation contributions, and automatic network and group identification engine, known as ANGI in Australia, not to be confused with ANGI, which is about the corporation, the corporate interest relief restriction in the UK under ANGI. But in this case, the acronym stands for Automated Network and Group Identification Engine. So Australia's using it, the Republic of Ireland, type in a query, no self-categorization, and they believe that the 70% accuracy rises to 97%. In terms of HMRC, lines of inquiries, so AI has been used in terms of anti-money laundering reports, child benefit claims, the construction industry scheme, CT in general, debt management, help to save, imports and customs, and IHT on that basis. So all of those elements have been used on that basis. In terms of other lines of inquiry, national insurance, the national minimum wage and the national living wage, income tax, self-employed, self-assessment tax returns, not self-employed, SATR, self-assessment tax returns, to deal with employer inquiries, trade, tariff support, so dealing with the ever-changing position in terms of tariffs, trusts, and VAT on that basis. In terms of popularity, HMRC reported 2.5 million interactions. That is possibly because of the time that people would otherwise spend hanging on the phone. Whether those interactions are all satisfactory is difficult to tell. So that's the sort of positive angle from the taxpayer's point of view. What about the enforcement element? So closing the net in terms of AI and investigations. And of course, what we're looking at is worldwide use. 95% of authorities use data analytics, say potentially around half are using AI. Certainly in the developed world, it is extremely prevalent. The USA used it recently as action against check fraud, but it also uses it in some of the one-to-many or nudge letters that the US do, notably on elements such as it's done a one-to-many letter on foreign companies raising, and the IRS has raised transfer pricing concerns. And if the foreign entity has not replied, or the entity with a foreign jurisdiction, a foreign interest hasn't replied, is normally followed up by an investigation. It's interesting because I had somebody who married to an American, and she said that she's a non-resident alien living in the UK, as is he. Well, he's a US citizen, but they still prompt the same questions about the wife's income, despite being married filing separate. In terms of Poland, they've used that to take action against VAT carousel fraud, something which goes on where goods and services are allegedly passed from one party to another, lots of reclaims of VAT, and then the company disappears into a puff of smoke. Sweden identifies high-risk cases and would also challenge deductions that are made. Israel, which is at the forefront of this technology, has used AI against non-compliant landlords on that basis, trying to ensure that landlords do declare if they have rental income. France, oh, I love this one. This has been used by Greece as well. France used aerial imagery to detect undeclared swimming pools, as did Greece. Indeed, when Greece introduced this charge and sent helicopters to photograph this areas before drones, the most popular thing for people to buy were tarpaulins to cover their swimming pools in camouflage colours. Different attitude towards compliance, I might add. In Spain, it's been used prompting taxpayers to file tax returns on that basis. So different countries using different elements. Let's look at the United Kingdom. So that links up the VAT with the land registry, credit reference agencies, DVLA, DWP, border agency, property sales, and electoral roll. Now, it wasn't that long ago that these were all siloed for data protection purposes. You couldn't just pass information across different arms of the government. That seems to be less of an issue now. So VAT might be linked up to my CT return for my owner managed business, and then to my income tax return. Land registry, if I buy a property, well, HMRC is going to find out, may inquire, A, have I paid the correct stamp duty? Is it my second property, for example? And B, the issue with it would be, where did I get the money from in the first place? Again, credit reference agencies give some very interesting information. DVLA, I've gone and bought a top of the range car, and where did I get the money from for it? DWP, obvious interaction between benefits and pay. That's why we've been doing RTI, real-time information, since 2013. My only point was there was a recent expose in the Spectator telling us that actually the RTI information was, even if provided on time, was not being used as efficiently as it could be by the DWP to adjust people's benefits. As salary goes up, your taxes go up, and potentially your benefits go down, and that linkage in terms of RTI has not really happened successfully in a large number of cases. Border agency, what sort of cases is the border agency going to become interesting in? Anybody? What sort of cases is the border agency going to become interested in? Anyone? No one? Obviously, in terms of people coming in and out of the country and their residence position, day counts and so on. And that obviously is information very useful to HMRC, and they do access it. Then there are also issues about property sales, where you get money from, have you declared the capital gains tax within 60 days of the date of completion? And the electoral roll, giving you a good idea potentially where your PPR is, your principal private residence is. Other elements you might think about would be the common reporting standards. And that may be issues in terms of cryptocurrency, online dealings. So HMRC will use AI and algorithms to track down people who do a lot of online dealings. Remember, if you buy and sell, it is likely that you would be trading. If you sell only, likely not to be seen as trading. And of course, to look at properties abroad, particularly for UK residents, and whether they're deriving income or whether they've made sales. Deriving income would result in an income tax charge, sales potentially a capital gains tax charge. There's a system called Xenon, which identifies income from online shops, trading platforms, and poker sites. And so therefore people playing poker and getting money, the same with trading platforms and online shops, can expect scrutiny if they're seen to report quite a lot of income via that, or gain income via that. Any questions at this point? So if there are no questions, we'll move on to the business use of AI. And ERPs, inventory management, supply chain logistics, finance, HR, and customer relations, so enterprise reporting. Those are important. They've been around a long time. Could AI speed them up in terms of the reporting, providing real-time management information, for example, which could save the business a lot of money, or indeed protect sales from a shortage in inventory. It's been around a long time. In terms of bookkeeping, what sort of assistance are you looking at? Well, that assistance could identify anomalies, irregularities, risks, fraud, billing patterns, and duplicate entries. All of those elements would be important for a bookkeeping and finance department. And of course, it still requires human intervention, human intuition, and maybe a bit of, serendipity time to look at things, stand back and look at them within a different context. AI is also helpful for tax authorities on that basis. And the question is always going to be, where judgment is required ultimately, it's also useful for you. So in the next section, what I'm looking at here is some areas where I think ultimately there is nothing that would beat human judgment and experience. So before I carry on, are there any questions or comments on what I've talked about? No questions? Oh, now a question. Will AI take over human accountants' jobs? That is the $64 million question, or $64 billion question. And my answer would be, I don't agree with the tube advert. There are certain functions that will be done by the AI in the same way that Excel, before Excel and spreadsheets, you just type everything. Before calculators, you would add up manually. Everything took longer. But as I pointed out, the burden of work seems to get greater as there are more activities, compliance activities. And also, I think in terms of judgment, in terms of planning, that is actually, I think, going to get busier because there'll be more to review on that basis. I hope that answers the question. I think it is possible that you will see less outsourced, less of the sort of regular routine, what some people call grunt work, shall we say, in terms of, I think some of the routine work that's done in the Philippines or elsewhere may come back to the UK on the basis that you will not need so many people inputting or processing. But I think it's always been the case ever since the inception of online returns that actually the real difficult element with that is not the information itself, but the interpretation of the information and what's put in the boxes in the first place. In other words, if you look at capital allowances or R&D, the actual calculation is easy enough to do on a spreadsheet, but it's working out what goes in capital allowances that is particularly difficult. And that's where the judgment and the value add is, and where clients will pay you more money in order to exercise your judgment. Let's take some examples. Oops, let's go another question. So, Rebecca's asked a very good question. What tips can you share as to how to filter the hype about AI from things that are actually useful? Well, I think the way I would answer that, Rebecca, is what I would say is, number one, are they trying to sell you something? If they're trying to sell you something, then there is a tendency, not by everybody, to actually, with technology, over promise on what it will do. How often has an IT system, whether in the public or private sector, failed to do what it says on the tin? That's number one. Number two, I think you look at things that are realistic. AI is at the stage where it can help you with routine tasks and help you with your job to make it quicker or more efficient. Actually, in terms of how far it goes, as I would say, when you need that in the final analysis, human judgment, I don't think AI is there, and I'm not sure it ever will substitute properly for human judgment. It's not that, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, we haven't thought about the fact that we could be replaced by a computer. I just think, in the ultimate resort, it is probably unlikely, particularly where human judgment is needed. And then you need to go back to the old-fashioned smell test. If it doesn't look right, it probably isn't. And also, I was sitting there in a restaurant with a friend who's a KC, and he said, "Oh, our Chambers has just bought quite an expensive AI tool. Can you ask me a tax question?" I was thinking about, I'm on Sunday lunch. Why should I be on duty? But it was quite interesting because he did, sort of put it into his phone, and it was about Pillar 2. Was a question I had about Pillar 2. And he came up with all sorts of information about Pillar 2. Some of it was interesting. There was quite a lot of it. Did it actually answer the question? No. So I tend to feel AI is a bit like politicians, They sometimes answer the questions, but sometimes they give you lots of information which doesn't answer the question. And therefore, I think you need to look, it's a bit like everything else in life. Are they promising the sun, earth, moon, and stars for this? And my view is, if they're doing that, at that point, you have to say, I'm more skeptical. Rebecca, did that answer your question? Okay, I'm going to have an answer on that. And then Jazz asked a question, do you have a list of helpful prompts when using AI? And the answer to that is no, except for what I would say in terms of helpful is, if I have a question, I want to give as much information as possible to that question. The dates I'm looking at, the jurisdiction of the legislation, as specific a question as I get. It's a bit like the old joke about the Delphic Oracle. So you may know the joke about the Delphic Oracle. So Croesus goes, a general, and king goes to the Delphic Oracle before a battle and says, what do you think is going to happen? And the Delphic Oracle says, I foresee a great victory. Croesus goes to war and gets hammered, goes back to the Delphic Oracle and says, but I lost. You must be wrong. And the Delphic Oracle said, yeah, I foresaw a great victory. I didn't tell you for whom. And it sort of reminds you that old Greek joke that you do need to frame your questions very carefully indeed. So the more information you have, the less likely that AI should go down rabbit holes. But again, you've got to have sufficient knowledge to know when it is going down rabbit holes as well. Hope that answers the question, Jazz. So where is judgment required? So a good example of judgment required would be research and development. Why? Well, for a start, as I talked about, boilerplate language, if you were doing an AI return, a return using AI, that is a menace. HMRC can spot boilerplate language from a mile off, and that could be a major issue. Other cautions in terms of this, it is easy to fall down in this area, and computers go wrong all the time. Just think of the UK Horizon project, or you can look up the Netherlands Child Benefit Project, which went horribly wrong, and I think might have caused the fall of a government, although they do seem to fall with quite on a regular basis in the Netherlands. But that's two examples of technology going horribly wrong. Another case would be RTI, where RTI was supposed to provide a seamless link to the benefit system, that when your income went up, the benefits went down, and vice versa. But it is not flawless. I had a neat recent occasion where so a friend was talking about a well-known accounting system which they decided to put in. Wasn't my friend's decision, and they decided it must all be right. And the accounts went all the way up to the board, and the directors then decided, do you know what? This doesn't make sense. I said, didn't heads roll because somebody should have looked at it more carefully? But again, it got some sort of confirmation bias. And that, I think, makes one of the difficulties. It comes out of the computer. It must be right. And that, I think, is really difficult to deal with. So, in terms of difficult research, let me look at a few tax challenges which could end up good examples of where AI, I'm not sure, might be helpful in gathering information, but how are you going to use it? The worst thing you can do is to have no prompts at all, which is to have something that says, tell me all about yourself. That will work potentially with a therapist or a psychiatrist. Not sure it works in terms of AI. Tell me everything I ever wanted to know about transfer pricing. Will give you a lot of guff, but will not answer your question. It may give you some very interesting reading material, but will not answer the question you have, I suspect. So don't use AI like a psychiatrist's couch. With documentation, with transfer pricing, you look at the documentation very carefully, and you may look at some benchmarking. Again, you want to look at the accuracy of that. But if you look at transfer pricing, look at the action on transfer pricing. It is from BEPS, profits are taxed where economic activities generating the profits are performed and where value is created. Oh my goodness. How are you going to use AI for that effectively? Ultimately, you have to do a functional analysis, working out where you think value is created. And where you're using intellectual property, for example, there will be an element of subjectivity to that. Who is performing a more valuable function? I would suspect that AI would not help you a great deal with that. You've got to use your judgment about the value of a product or a service in terms of who is providing what value within the group, who's taking the risk, and so on. And whereas AI might provide you with some of the material, it's not going to be able, in my view, to create an accurate judgment on that basis. Anyone who has a dissenting view, please let me know. Quite happy to take dissenting views on this. At this point, can we have the next poll, please? So if you would like to fill something in at that point. Shall we see the results, please? Oh, yes. And quite a lot of people put it into the somewhat category. So they're not quite sure. Sort of 55% in there, only 21% in a great deal. I'm between the somewhat and the a little, I would say, but we'll see. But I think an interesting spread of answers on that basis. Okay, let's take a 10-minute coffee break now. Screen break. Sorry, did anyone have any questions? Any other questions before I carry on? So that's a good example I was talking about before the break of transfer pricing, which in the ultimate resort, AI can produce lots of data for you, but ultimately you're going to have to do the judgment. And I don't think that is going to change. Indeed, what may happen is, of course, you get more data, and on the basis of getting more data, you will end up having to do more review work. Because this stuff churns out lots. And it's a bit like your contract, your account's going from 30 pages to 225, or your contract's going from 15 pages to 100. Somebody somewhere has got to review it. Let's look at R&D. So there are three categories of R&D as defined in the guidelines, and this has been a major issue in terms of what qualifies pure or basic research, experimental theoretical work undertaken primarily to acquire new research or new scientific or technical knowledge for its own sake, rather than directed towards any specific aim or application. You then potentially are looking at applied research, that's original critical investigation undertaken in order to gain new scientific or technical knowledge and directed towards a specific practical aim or objective. And development, use of scientific or technical knowledge in order to produce new or substantially improved materials, devices, products, or services, to install new processes or systems prior to the commencement of commercial production or commercial applications, or to improving substantially those already produced or installed. Now, what you can see from that is quite clearly, on that basis, what you are looking at there is elements that require judgment. What is acquiring new scientific, what is scientific or technical knowledge? What is original critical investigation? What is new processes or systems, or improving, and the word substantially, I think, would be important, those already produced or installed. These have all come up in the courts, and HMRC is taking, as you may see, a more vigorous line in respect of R&D. Why are they taking a more vigorous line? Well, because of the massive overclaiming there's been, the massive abuse of the system. Has AI helped? No, because AI produced reports have been put into HMRC to try and deal with dubious claims. As I say, normally included experimental, theoretical, or other work aimed at the discovery of new knowledge or the advancement of existing knowledge, searching for application of that knowledge, formulation and design of possible applications of such work, and testing in search or evaluation of product, service, or process alternatives. This is not straightforward. And because it's not straightforward, it needs judgment. It might need some scientific knowledge and judgment. It certainly, you need to understand what the company is doing and then apply your judgment about whether you can claim it or not. It goes on, normally included in design would be construction and testing of pre-production prototypes and models, and development batches and design of products, services, processes, or systems, improving new technology or substantially improving those already produced or installed, and the construction and operation of pilot plants on that basis. The last bit is probably fairly reasonably easy to look at, but again, substantially improving those already produced or installed. What is substantial? What is business as usual? And what's actually really development? And again, the judgment is required before you actually put any figures on the return. And I remember somebody who couldn't take this through. I said, well, most of our R&D is actually deciding what qualifies rather than your computation. The computation could be done mainly by computer, but you need to know the figures that go into that computation. Normally excluded would be testing analysis either of equipment or product for purposes of quality or quantity control, i.e. once you've got it in. Periodic alterations to existing products or services or processes, even though these may represent some improvement. So on that basis, how big an improvement? Is it a small improvement? Is it a big improvement? Did you need to get a project team? Did you need to put in a budget? Did you record what the project was and what you were planning to do? And then sort of operational research not tied to a specific research and development activity. and that's operational research. And the other element is cost of corrective action in connection with breakdowns during commercial production wouldn't be allowed, whereas breakdowns during the pilot element would be allowed. And then finally, on the exclusions, it would be legal and administrative work in connection with patent applications, records, and litigations in the sale or licensing of patents, an activity including design and construction, engineering relating to construction, relocation, rearrangement, or startup of facilities or equipment, other than facilities or equipment whose sole use is for a particular research and development project. Again, what is this equipment being used for? And on that basis, can you claim it? And also the other element that you can't claim for is market research. So it's a bit like the creative industries, the beginning of the feasibility study, you can't claim creative release for, but once you've got the get-go to produce the film, you can then start claiming. Market research, where does research start and market research end? Again, judgment would be required, and I would argue quite clearly that the judgment call on that is probably beyond AI. Any comments on that? If you've got anything in the chat box. Or in the Q&A. So from there, let me move to PPR, Principal Private Residence Relief. And, it is now, I've just produced in Tolley's Tax Digest a new guide for PPR, available in all good booksellers. And the issue is that PPR is a very valuable relief, potentially worth tens of millions for very expensive properties, because it's unlimited. And the options on this basis is that you may have, when you sell a property, residential property, you may have full principal private residence relief and therefore fully exempt. You may have partial exemption where there is some CGT due because of the periods of absence. You got investment. It's just an investment property, no exemption, CGT. Or maybe it's trading and it's income tax. And, every month there is at least one case about this. And it is 60 years since the legislation, over 60 years, since the legislation was first formulated. And indeed, on that basis, you've even got the situation where even with the changes that have happened, which have slightly restricted the relief, the main principles are still being argued over. They're being argued over more because of the volatility of property prices, and people are more mobile. And of course, buy-to-lets were unknown, almost unknown 60 years ago. Quick reminder that it's found in Section 222 of the Taxation Charitable Gains Act 1992 as interpreted by the courts. There have been recent changes to legislation and some curbs on the use of the relief. But let's look at the qualification for PPR. So dwelling house or part of a dwelling house which is or has at any time in the vendor's period of ownership been his or her only main residence, or land which the individual has for his own occupation and enjoyment with that residence as its garden or ground up to the permitted area. So if you ask about some facts and circumstances about whether a property will qualify in part or in whole for PPR, you will get a stack of cases, some which HMRC have won, some which the taxpayers won. When I totted it up on the basis of the big cases, is about 50-50. You look at the wording of the legislation, and you can't go very far without requiring quite a lot of interpretation, which has been provided by the courts. A dwelling house. What constitutes a dwelling house? part of a dwelling house? Is it self-contained? Who is the period of ownership? Oh my goodness. You know, what is an ownership? When does ownership start? You look at the Higgins case about off-plan purchases and so on. Only or main residence. Well, has he, you know, it can't be just acquiring a property. Have you made it into a residence? And land which the individual has for his own occupation and enjoyment with that residence as its garden or ground up to the permitted area on that basis. So that is the point on that basis is, okay, land, that's fairly obvious. Own occupation, again, been subject to issue with the courts. Enjoyment has definitely been up to issues with the courts. As its garden, what is a garden? Or ground up to the permitted area, which is 0.5 of a hectare, but could be more if, as in one of the cases, quite recent case, you've got a situation where the grounds are bigger, but they're bigger for almost every house in the area. And HMRC selectively chose the few houses with smaller gardens than 0.5 hectares, but actually the taxpayer was able to show that the vast majority of properties had more than 0.5 of a hectare on that basis. So the challenges on that basis would be the identification of the property which qualifies for PPR, the extent of the grounds, the actual and deemed occupation of the grounds, the residence of the individuals, and the intention of the individuals on that basis. And what you can see is AI will take you only so far. It can give you a welter of cases. You can look at my new digest, but ultimately you need to apply the facts of the client in front of you and put in a judgment. Any questions on that? So I've shown you transfer pricing and PPR, two radically different areas of the taxation system where both of them require considerable judgment in what is a very complex area and is costly if you get wrong. Any questions or comments even? No? Okay, so let's look at PCRT, professional conduct with relationship to taxation and ethics, and with AI as well. So in brief, the headline point there is, you know, practitioner is responsible if they use AI, and you need to review the work. And that may be more difficult if people are working from home and maybe using unlicensed or unauthorized forms of AI. We'll come to that. The governance is knowing who is using AI, the extent the AI is explainable, who is authorized to use it, and do you have limitations within your firm in terms of who and how AI is used. You need to get guidance on the prompts that you use to get results on that basis. And you'd end up with engineering the prompts, a prompt library, and as I talked before about, the temperature use, you know, how difficult, complex, controversial is the area that you are researching. You need to think about what we call policy awareness. In the same way you have a money laundering reporting officer, you do need someone who is overall responsible for your AI policy. to ensure that there is compliance with legislation. The engagement reflects the use of AI. So if you're going to use it a lot, does the client know? Do they need to know? Is it germane or relevant to the engagement? AI output is checked and conditions for using AI are understood. And that's a difficulty because obviously there will be different levels of skill in terms of technology. But skill in technology does not necessarily mean skill in terms of how do you apply it. In other words, the people who have the greatest knowledge of tax may not be the best at AI and vice versa. And you need to look at bridging that gap. And in terms of AI in particular, where you're not using the licensed product that you've bought, but have gone for some public chatbot, I think that could also cause you considerable difficulties. In terms of data, it needs to be stored, cleansed, structured, and retrieved where appropriate. It can't be in the form of a complete mess. This was fake news reported on the Today programme, 7th of January 2025. This is Apple and fake news AI feature. There was a darts player, Luke Littler, who won a competition before he did. False news regarding the sexuality of a leading tennis player. Generating false news on the 2nd of January 2025. Could this happen in tax? Possibly. As we've seen in a number of cases, AI can create false information in cases that just do not exist. Apple has also said that it will update rather than pause the new artificial intelligence feature that's generated inaccurate news alerts on its latest iPhones. The company in it, so this is after this news broke. The company's first acknowledgement of concerns on Monday said it was working on a software change to further clarify when the notifications and summaries that have been generated by the Apple intelligence system. The tech giant is facing calls to pull the technology after its flawed performance. The BBC complained last month when, after an AI-generated summary of its heading, falsely told some readers that Luigi Mangione, the man accused of killing United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, had shot himself. That was the shooting in the United States. On Friday, Apple's AI inaccurately summarized BBC's notifications to claim that Luke Littler had won the PDC World Darts Championship hours before it began, and that Spanish tennis star Rafael Nadal had come out as gay, which was not the case. This marks the first time Apple has formally responded to the concerns voiced by the BBC about the errors, which appear as if they're coming from within the organization's app. These AI summarizations by Apple do not reflect, and in some cases completely contradict, the original BBC content, the BBC said on Monday. It is critical that Apple urgently addresses these issues, as the accuracy of our news is essential in maintaining trust. And you can see where the problems can happen. And of course, as I say, could it happen in time? Others. So Reporters Without Borders, an organization representing the rights and interests of journalists, called on Apple to disable the feature in December. Maybe also there's a certain amount of self-interest because it's sort of competition for reporters. It said the attribution of a false headline about Mr. Mangione to the BBC showed that generative AI services are still too immature to produce reliable information for the public. Apple is not alone in having rolled out generative AI tools that can create text, images, and more content when prompted by users, but with varying results. Apple's AI Overviews feature, which provides a written summary of information from results at the top of its search engine in response to user queries, faced criticism last year for producing some erratic responses. That's Google's as well as Apple's. At the time, a Google spokesperson said these were isolated examples and the feature was generally working well. But how would you know if you don't know the background to what you're looking for? So my conclusion is that human research will still be required. And in terms of questions, the questions are going to be, are you using secure databases, recognized authorities, and do you have policies and procedures in place for this? So before we go on to valuing the output, how about we do, I think it's the final poll question. The final poll question. Let's give you a couple of minutes to answer that one. Okay, so let's publish the poll. Research, computations, very few. Letters, interesting. I'm wondering whether that's the origination of the letters or sort of catching them up. Presentations and others on that basis. It's all quite interesting from that point of view. Letters, a lot of, I can see, and research. I sort of understand that, and that's what I think is probably quite sensible. I also think had a question. How do we answer none to question 4? Sorry, perhaps I should have put in none. Apologies, Richard. Not at all option as well. Okay, understood. None. So I will assume that some people don't use it at all. Just shows human being can make mistakes. Didn't put that through AIs because otherwise it might have told me I should put none on it, but probably not. Okay. Right. So valuing the output. What are you going to bill your client? And obviously there's an element of, do I get a larger margin? You know, people talking about research that used to take them days, now taking them hours. Are you going to do the billing as a value billing? Are you going to do it based on the cost of acquiring the software, the time, the value, or and the risk? Remember, obviously, that AI processes and procedures, bring them in, will probably involve quite a bit of non-chargeable time. So you may want to try and recover that with some sort of premium when you use AI. But it's something you need to think about in terms of the billing and your process and procedures, because if it's fairly obvious that you've just downloaded it from a piece of AI, the client may be less prepared to pay a large sum for it. There is, I know, value billing, but there is a limitation to that, particularly if the customer could access the same AI. If you're accessing it from a proprietary AI that is subscription only, then you've got more justification. Obviously, in terms of this, there is obviously the risk of devaluing the advice. The golf club element, that instead of getting the rubbish advice off the golf club, you've got peers of mine who already get a situation. I've produced this off AI. Do you think this is correct? And thinking, well, no, this is generic. This is not specifically to you. And I'm going to have to do some work to deal with it. So it's the same as the internet advice. And with AI, there's always the possibility of underestimating how many shades of grey there is in tax, in terms of where there are fine judgments, nuances, and of course, genuine uncertainty. In terms of what is the future, so when you have, so this is from Dan, who talked about the innovation trigger, peak of inflated expectations, which is where we may be at with AI. That may lead to a trough of disillusionment, and then a more realistic assessment of what it could do, AI, and then the plateau of productivity, which is where most forms of technology have gone through in terms of wild changes in terms of expectations, but arriving at something which creates a stable improvement of productivity and the quality of work. This is something from the ICAW. Personal tax returns take member practices an average of 2 hours a week. 70% of this time is spent chasing the customer for information and entering data. What is the current tax process? Well, if I look at that, roll forwards, the tax year shared data request, aide memoire, send a reminder, enter the data into the compliance app, start work, find out if there's data missing, send more reminders, complete the submission, normally about the 30th of January, send to customer for approval, and then submit to HMRC. What might be the future tax process? Roll forwards the tax year, share data request, send a reminder, extract data and enter into the compliance app, which may be done by an AI or robot work. So you start the work, find out there's data missing, send more reminders, doesn't happen. Well, that is what they think. I'm not so sure about that. You should be able to take information and think, oh, I wonder, why is that not there? Didn't they talk about selling a property? Didn't they talk about changing their tax status? What happened in the meetings we had? Complete the submission, send to customer for approval, and then submit to HMRC. There is an element about it which would reduce the amount of work. But whether it would reduce it as much as is claimed, I think people may be a bit disappointed. Clients being who they are, have them look at actually real. You should try and get in your tax return by the 31st of July. Why? So that you can adjust your payments on account, maybe, and get it done before your summer holidays. But how many people actually manage to achieve that? In the same way, if you're doing an annual VAT return, because your turnover is about 1.35 million, for a lot of businesses, not a great deal of extra work to do all the CT compliance, the accounts, the IXBRL and the CT comp, and the CT 600, and get it all in at the same time. So you're not re-looking at the same piece of paperwork. But how many people do it? Very small numbers. In terms of what they think potentially, what they think will change is that currently you spend a lot of time simulating scenarios, thinking, and with the client, and they think that simulating scenarios will reduce because AI will do that. Thinking will increase because you'll have more data to sift through and more time to do it, proper job on that, and then probably more time with the client after you're thinking about doing what you should be doing. And of course, that should lead to better recoveries on that basis because you're more upfront with the client, it's more time with them, more that they can see and value what you're doing. Going back to safeguards, 68 to 74% of employees admit to using AI solutions not sanctioned by their organization. And that's a real issue, I think, on that basis. I think that is where it is out of control, and probably with home working is even more out of control. What are the sort of good practices in terms of prompts? So in terms of prompts, you might look at basic prompts, start with a goal, summarize this PowerPoint presentation. You can see that that's Americanese. Good prompt, add context. Adding context can help Copilot understand the purpose of the summary and tailor the response accordingly. For my boss, that includes an overview of the main points before meeting with their client. Better prompt, adding sources can help Copilot understand which presentation or part needs to be summarized and provide a more accurate response. Using slides 5 to 10 in this PowerPoint presentation. Best prompt, lastly, adding expectations that can help Copilot understand how to format the summary and what level of detail is required. Final prompt, please format the main points as a bulleted list and use a professional tone. Summarize this presentation for my boss that includes an overview of the main points before meeting the client using slides 5 to 10 in this PowerPoint presentation. Please format the main points as a bulleted list and use a professional tone. And they believe you do that. That's much better than say, tell me everything about a particular form of tax or Pillar 2 or anything else. Any comments on that? So if I look at myth and reality, the myth, I think, is AI will lead to lots of job losses. It's likely to change the workload, but I'm not convinced, unless it is a radical break from all technology in the last 250 years. It's likely to not to decrease overall numbers. Roles may change, but it's not going to decrease numbers on that basis. Letters produced by AI will be more accurate. No, I think they can be completely wrong, unless what you're doing is just getting them to amend, or you put proper prompts in, like I talked about, which directs AI where you want it to go. And Jem's asked me a question, won't this prevent the juniors from learning themselves? Well, I think you need to be careful in terms of this, that juniors understand something that older people do, is that you have to have a healthy skepticism of what you read. What is the basis on which it comes? So that's training to use AI properly on that basis. And you're going to need to look for, in my view, lots of guidance in this area. AI will lead to more professional outcomes. I would say only if used properly, like in the prompts I talked about. The traps in this basis would be elements such as over-reliance, no sense check, and Google Maps. Example is a great example of that. As I say, I've gone wrong more than once on that. You need to have a sense check. Where am I going? Is this leading me in roughly the right direction? Do I recognize it? That's going to lead to a position which will save money and improve quality. Whereas if I really don't know where I'm going and just say, tell me everything you know, that is going to lead to problems. Other elements in which this has been used, so HMRC can use information. There was a VAT defaulter, and HMRC tracked down the VAT defaulter to Wales, where he ordered a doner kebab online. So that's an interesting element, remembering that all the information that you put in the public domain, HMRC can look at whether it is your credit card spending, your debit card spending, what you put in LinkedIn, Meta, or indeed on GPT. In terms of tax authorities, there are always question marks, access potentially to more information, joining up the dots, and will they use the information wisely? And there are mixed results. The RTI and some of the issues in terms of universal credit have shown, that they can make mistakes and systemic mistakes. I had one where they just automated the VAT quarterly payment system last year. And I'm a March year end, so I'd done my VAT return, my yearly VAT return by May the 6th. They then sent me a note of what my quarterly payments would be, which was right on the letter and had been clearly that year computer generated. Because in the previous year where it was manually generated, I was phoning up on the 25th of July saying, look, I've got to make a payment. What is it? They've also updated the online system. However, they had made a mistake because they doubled up the amount I needed to pay in July and started saying I was defaulting and there were penalties and interest. So I got hold of them and said, look, here is the letter. This is the amount I'm supposed to pay. You've doubled it up in July. Why? It's not right. And then not only did they change it, so I got through to somebody relevant on the helpline and they changed it, but they also wrote me quite an interesting letter because I said, well, I'm probably not the only person. This looks like a systemic mistake. You ought to have a look at it. But that's always the issue with new technology. When you're a presenter, the one thing you don't want to have when you start at a new client is, oh, we've just updated the technology. It's going to take you the best part of an hour to get your slides up on their whatever system they've got. So there are always teething problems with these things. So if I look at it further, my view is AI will evolve. It will become considerably more sophisticated, but will still need the human touch. And indeed, I think there will be more work for reviewers in terms of, number one, the clients will expect a faster service. Number two, you've got hopefully more time to review and do quality stuff on a return before, instead of the deadline of just sending it out. What should the client do? Have they got too much investment income subject to tax? Should they put more in ISAs? Should they put more in special investments? What is the profile of the client? What is the tax return telling me about their pattern of income? And could they be doing things like surplus gifts out of regular income, escaping IHT? All of those sorts of things you should have more time to do to review and think around the subject and help the client. And that's why I think that the human touch is going to be so important. And that, I think, is going to be one of the key elements. As I say, I'm not convinced it will reduce the numbers of people. I think it will change the role. And as was said in the presentation, you're going to have to make your practice more human, because it's going to be human judgment that is going to be required. So interesting enough, when Dan Dransfield of TTEC, Accountancy Technologies, talked about it, he said, well, the final element is that I think people are going to have to, a practice is going to have to become more human, not less. And you will need more of that intuition to change something from a compliance process to a value add judgment process that helps your clients and means that you are seen as providing considerable value in what you do. Anyway, on that basis, I'm happy to take any further questions if they are. Any questions? I haven't had as many as I thought, and I certainly allowed a bit more time for questions. But otherwise, thank you very much. Here, oh, another question. Good. No, thank you. Well, thank you is always very nice anyway. But as I say, I hope you found that useful. And maybe another question. So thank you. Always good with the thank yous. But otherwise, if not, I'll hand back to Helen. And thank you very much. If you want to get hold of me, this is email address. If you've got any questions, my thanks again, particularly to the people who helped with it, the presentation, people like Dan from T-Tech, but also people from the family who are immersed in AI all the time. Thank you very much indeed.